Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the globe. Today is Tuesday, July 9th, 2024. Our guest for this episode is Brian Bonner, who is former chief editor and executive director of the Kyiv Post. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English since 1933 for the global Ukrainian community. Welcome, Brian. How are you?
Well, good to hear from you and happy to be on the program. I am a regular reader and supporter of Ukrainian Weekly.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear, Brian. So to start off with, can we get some educational and professional background from you?
Sure, the short story is I have a BA in history from the University of Minnesota, and I spent the next 20 plus years at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. I left there in 2007, returned to become the chief editor of the Kyiv Post in 2008. That's the short history. I first arrived in Ukraine in 1996 through a contact at the University of Minnesota on a journalism exchange program, and so I've been coming and going to Ukraine since then. So 28 years. I'm not Ukrainian at all. I'm just one of those people who fell in love with the place and the whole dynamic of this society and transformation. A little too dramatic sometimes for my taste, but never boring.
And what led you to the Kyiv Post in 2008?
Well, been a journalist for most of my career, not all of it. I've had some detours in election observation and public health and some other things, but I've been mainly a journalist for 40 plus years, coming to uh, the end of my career. And I worked at the University of Minnesota Daily, which is one of the great, college newspapers in America. And the editor-in-chief, Victoria Sloan, ended up in the State Department working at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And in 1996, she asked if I would come out for a journalism exchange, and I did. And I met the owner, American, also from who went to university in Minnesota, McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jed Sundin founded the newspaper in 1995, and I'm still pretty monolingual, unfortunately. But so I found, as I say, I found the job I was qualified for, which was editing the English language newspaper. And, I was there originally in 1999, left very quickly. And then I came back in 2008. Jed Sundin was still the owner. And then, stayed until 2021, end of 2021. And I've worked for all three owners. So I've seen the transition of what I call Ukraine before the big war.
And what changes in Ukraine have you witnessed as chief editor and eventually executive director of the Kyiv Post?
Well, from one point of view, monumental and swift changes. I mean, I had never been in the Soviet Union, but when I got here in 1996, Ukraine was suffering. It was a basket case. There were still the Karbovanets, the coupon, which was not a currency that was, it was just a temporary currency until they got to hryvnia. And people were suffering. And it was like black and white gangster movie, it seemed like. Pavel Lazarenko, the famously corrupt prime minister, was in charge at the time. Kuchma was the president. There was a real hunger for transition, a hunger for a different life, a hunger for knowing what life is like beyond Ukraine, because Ukrainians at that time had been stifled and colonized and suppressed and abused during the Soviet Union and for centuries before that, actually. And so a lot of them had not been abroad. And so, you go to 2017 when they got visa-free travel. You go to the revolutions in 2004 and 2014. These were all really about throwing off the autocracy, throwing off the Soviet ways, reuniting, re-engaging in the world. And so Ukrainians have succeeded, and that's, a great thing, but it also triggered, Vladimir Putin's obsession with going to war against Ukraine and declaring to the world that Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. It will never be a sovereign nation if he has his way, and that it's part of the great Russian Empire, the horrible Russian Empire. So that all that I've been able to witness, in minute detail and day by day. But that's been the big sweeping change. It hasn't changed enough for a lot of people. Ukraine as a nation still needs to obviously have a stronger defense, because as long as it lives next door to Russia with its imperialistic ambitions, Ukraine will always be, I think, in a perpetual state of war. It still has not fully developed the democratic institutions that are required for a full-fledged democracy, or created the conditions that would attract a large amount of foreign investment. But they're getting there, and it's become, because of the war, nothing good happens in the war. But one of the things that happened is Ukrainians have become more international than ever, because we have 6 million Ukrainians living abroad in Europe, so they've become much more worldly. The downside, among the many downsides, is that we've lost so many people. It's a different place, and the birth rate is plummeting. I think the benchmark number was 1 million births per year in 1991 or in the early 1990s. That dropped last year to less than 200,000. So this is a nation that really needs to win, and win soon.
Please discuss your current journalistic activities, including your work for the Cipher Brief and the Hromadske Radio podcast, Ukraine Calling.
Well, the Cipher Brief is a very interesting website. It's devoted strictly to national security issues. So if you go on it, and global security issues, if you go on it, it's really a lot caters to people who, and quotes, people who've been in the CIA, Defense Department, military, ambassadors, and so forth. So it was a natural way for me to, transition away from a digital think tank where I worked also on global affairs for 2 years. And I helped put together their open source report, which is basically a daily roundup of world news, and do some freelance writing for them. Now, Hromadske Radio is one of the few English language programs they have. And it was started originally in 2016 by a Canadian Ukrainian named Marta Dichok. She's a professor. And it went until 2019, and then it was sporadic, and then it sort of fell off during COVID and fell off during the full-scale invasion, the big war in 2022. And then I just met with the station management, and they were interested in reviving it, and donors, the U.S. government media support arm, was interested in more English language content and journalism and commentary, current events commentary. So it was good. It was a good thing. I think I've done 20 episodes out of 25 I have current funding for. And I hope to continue past the end of August, because it's been very interesting, very different, a big transition from a newspaper guy who likes to talk a lot to a YouTube guy who needs to short, pithy sentences.
And is there any particular theme or direction with the podcast?
Well, I like to do them in studios, but actually we've been really and because I mean I think I want to give people a feel of being in the capital, in the Ukrainian capital. There's many podcasts and there's many. Everybody has a YouTube and Substack, but this is really meant to put a spotlight on not exclusively Ukrainians, but a lot of Ukrainians, and many, many, many more. That's another thing that's changed. Are very fluent in English and other languages. That's a big transition, as well as the rise, the ascendance of the Ukrainian language, and the refusal of more people to speak Russian. So I have, if you look at the history, I have retired General Ben Hodges, American, Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, but also Ukrainian members of parliament. I have members of the business community. Let's see, last week's episodes, business associations. This week I'm going to have in the studio Alexander Matvichuk, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from 2022. So it's really a mix of people. The most recent episode was Dmitry Shimkiev, who is now in the war drone industry, the growing war drone industry. He was a former CEO of Microsoft and, of course, a former deputy head of the presidential administration under President Petro Poroshenko. Upcoming episodes, I have Alexander Mereshko, who's the chair of the Foreign Policy Committee of the Verkhovna Rada. So you get the idea. It's basically newsmakers who are at the center of the action here.
Brian, you already talked about changes you saw in Ukraine while you were at the Kiev Post. What changes have you seen since the Russian invasion of 2022?
Well, the good part, I don't think there is such a good thing as a good part, but of any war, actually, because this whole war is horrible from every aspect. But what we learned about it is Ukrainians are going to fight for their nation and their sovereignty. And they're not going to lose independence if they can at all help it. And they do not want to live under Russian occupation. We know that, but that's become so much more clear since the big war, as Ukrainians call it. The problem is that people need to suffer and people get killed, and there's frustration because it's been going on a long time. There's no end in sight, and still 20%, almost 20% of Ukrainian territory is under occupation by the enemy. Now, the bad side is besides the killing, besides the destruction, and by the way, I had an injury and I go to rehabilitation nearby, and most of the other people are soldiers who are very, maimed, trying to recover from very grievous war wounds. Socially, the fabric has been ripped up because many families are abroad, many women and children, and many men are here. The economy, of course, shrank by 25% and is highly dependent not only on Ukrainian innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, which does exist very strongly, but also heavily on the West. And that's a precarious way to live.
Do you think the EU and the US are doing enough to help Ukraine win the war?
No, that is the short answer. And it's very obvious, needs to do more. Actually, there needs to be a strategy to win the war. And that is a big problem. But I also think Ukraine needs to do more also to win the war. And by that, I mean fix the manpower shortage. In a nation where almost 20% of it is under foreign occupation, Ukrainian society is adjusting, but needs to adjust faster to the unfortunate idea that it's going to be in war for a very long time. And I think that's going to mean becoming a big Israel, which is what President Zelensky has said. And that's going to mean drafting men at a younger age than 27. Now, that went down to 25 in recent legislation, but that took a long time. And I think the military standard would be for a country at war to start drafting people at the age of 18. I think it will increase political support for Ukraine, and it will lead to fewer casualties from the overstretched, very exhausted military that has been defending the country for all these years.
Brian, we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask you one more question. What challenges do you think the media faces in Ukraine today?
Well, I think that the challenge of freedom, the challenge of reporting what you believe to be the truth. There's still a lot of hangover, I would say, from authoritarian attitude that the press needs to tell the story that the people in power want it to tell. That's bad. That needs to go away. We've also had, censorship. Naturally, there is censorship in war. That's a given. But behind this censorship, it should not be hiding corruption, because corruption in a nation at war is stealing from a nation at war is about the worst thing that can happen. That's a horrible thing. And with the weak institutions that Ukraine has in government and law enforcement and in the courts, it is often journalists who expose wrongdoing and provide the platform for the debate. I mean, the other problem before the big war and before the little war, the biggest problem that Ukraine had was a problem that is not unique to Ukraine, but amplified because Ukraine is not a rich country. And that is financing independent journalism, financing media, and removing it from oligarchic control, which has happened. We'll see what happens after the big war. That needs to happen. So you need basically a lot of competing voices, and we do have that, but they need to be financed so that journalism is a career that people can go to and serve, the truth, the interest of the truth, which is what most journalists are after, and have a decent wage. I mean, no journalist goes in there thinking, oh, I'm going to get rich. Absolutely not. But journalists also need to be able to work for organizations that are financially stable.
Brian, where can our audience go to listen to your podcast, Ukraine Calling?
Great question. YouTube, Ukraine Calling. My subscriber numbers are building. That was a new twist. I would like to see more. So go to YouTube, type in Ukraine Calling. You'll find me. Hromadske Radio website, and anywhere wherever you get your podcasts, you can find Ukraine Calling, because we're on all the platforms.
Brian, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
I really appreciate the time, Michael. Take care.
I have been speaking with Brian Bonner, former chief editor and executive director of the Kyiv Post. This is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the globe. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English since 1933 for the global Ukrainian community. Until next time, that's all for now.